what I think happened when Xi Jinping took over was that they sort of decided, well, actually, we don't have to accept their rules. We don't have to accept their system. We're not junior partners to the United States and the West. We're going to assert ourselves, and we're going to do everything even more our way, whatever the consequences for everyone else. And I think Xi Jinping, therefore, took China on a wrong course. Some have described it as a cul-de-sac. Well, let's see whether it's a cul-de-sac. I think.
大家好，我是老吴。今天咱们聊一个有意思的现象：有些国家其实早就不是世界舞台的中心了，但他们的一些政客好像还活在过去，总惦记着对今天真正的大国说三道四，好像地球还得听他们。咱们今天要说的这位就是来自那个曾经的日不落帝国，英国的一位老牌的政客，他叫彼得·曼德尔森，确实是英国驻美国的大使，在英国政坛和欧盟也算混了不少年，有点名气。这段访谈里，他把前朝遗老那个镜头表现得相当到位，接着深刻反思了一番英国和西方怎么才终于对中国看清了现实，接着一副高人姿态给中国的政策提建议，最后还不忘强调大英对遥远的印太地区也要负起责任。接下来咱们就一起来看看这位英国的老政客是怎么一本正经的活在梦里指点江山的。
All of us are more concerned now about supply chain resilience and security. We in the West, frankly, including Britain, have become overly exposed to and overly dependent on supply from China. China is now a country with whom we are all engaged in a strategic rivalry. It doesn't mean to say that we want to cut off relations with China or that we suddenly want to turn China into some sort of enemy or whatever, but we have to be realistic about it. We are competing with China. In some respects, China, not least, for example, in the support they're giving to Putin and Russia and Ukraine, has become a bit of an adversary to us. So we have to be realistic about this, I'm afraid. And whilst...
Would you say your views of China have changed?
Yes, they have.
Yeah.
Yes, they have. I mean, I think I've gone through sort of three stages, really, with China. First of all, when I was the European Union's Trade Commissioner in the first decade of this century, I was essentially bedding down China into the international trading system following its entry into the World Trade Organization 2 years before. And that was a sort of a bedding down of China in what we assumed would be a clear framework, clear principles, clear trade rules. Then we had in Britain, under the Conservative leader, David Cameron, what they called the golden era. And that was throw the doors open, throw the windows open, bring China in, and let's all have a wonderful jamboree. Well, we're not in that era anymore, and so we're in the third era, I would say, where we're coming to terms with China's extraordinary exponential economic growth, the way in which it has come to dominate in many aspects the international trading system by operating an economic model that is committed to vast overproduction and an assumption, frankly, that the rest of the world will simply suck up their surplus capacity, whatever the consequences for our own domestic production and trading position. Now, I don't think we can accept that as given, presented to us on a plate by China. I would just, though, add this, if I may, Rula. It's an area where the president here has identified a real issue, a real challenge. And in trade, he's taking measures and action to combat what he thinks needs to be addressed and has been ignored by governments previously. All I would say is that in addressing the imbalances in trade that China has created, and the wider deficiencies, frankly, in the international trading system and its rule book as operated by the WTO, it would be better for the United States to work with other big players in the trading system than relying simply on its own efforts. So if we're going to...
Or alienate the others by imposing tariffs, because it would make a lot more sense if the US works with Britain and Europe to try to isolate China. But what's happened now is they've imposed tariffs on everybody.
I'm not suggesting that we can sort of take China and put it in the corner on the naughty chair and say, we're now going to isolate China. China's a bit large for that. Now, what I'm saying is that if we are really going to bring about the rebalancing that we want, it's better for two huge trade players like the United States and the European Union to work together in doing that, and to recruit other, including Asian countries, to that program, to those policies. And that's the only sort of addendum I would add, which is, yes, you're right to identify the problem. I can understand the actions that you're taking, but frankly, if you really want in the long term to have the impact on China, better to work with others. But China has got to come to terms with the fact that not just in the United States, but in Europe as well, and other countries as well, are not simply prepared to sit back and suck up everything they give to us in trade. They've got to make an adjustment and reflect a little bit more on how they've got into a situation where, frankly, yes, there are a lot of people who trade vast amounts with China, but they do so slightly resentfully, and they don't like the imbalance that has been created by China's economic model.
What would you be advising them now?
China?
Yeah, I mean, you do have very good relations with some.
Well, I was more a previous era.
Yeah.
I was more a President Xi era. And
But what is the best way for China today to reach some kind of an understanding with the US? Because they seem to be tempted to wait until there's really
when I was
change
Trade
in the
Commissioner,
US.
I had so many discussions with Chinese leaders, and I said, you're building up something which is going to burst. I'm telling you, I know my people in Europe, we're going to take it and go along with this, but if you don't do more to open up your economy, if you don't do more to rebalance trade, if you don't create opportunities in China for us in Europe, if you don't create the chance for us to benefit more from China's growth, there's going to be a backlash. And I use the term backlash again and again and again. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, Premier Wen Jiabao, the Commerce Minister, I spoke to them all, the International Department, I said, there is going to be a backlash. This was in the first decade of this century. Xi Jinping then comes along, takes over from the previous leaders, most of whom were operating in a frame of thinking that Deng Xiaoping had sort of embarked on at the end of the 70s and the early 80s, which was, in a sense, what China was doing was, yes, taking huge advantage of the international trading system, but they were also prepared, I thought then, to exercise a bit more responsibility, to understand the needs and demands of the rest of the world with whom they were in an economic and trade partnership. They were, in a sense, navigating their way as new and emerging partners in that international system. What I think happened when Xi Jinping took over was that they sort of decided, well, actually, we don't have to accept their rules. We don't have to accept their system. We're not junior partners to the United States and the West. We're going to assert ourselves, and we're going to do everything even more our way, whatever the consequences for everyone else. And I think Xi Jinping, therefore, took China on a wrong course. Some have described it as a cul-de-sac. Well, let's see whether it's a cul-de-sac. I think arguably it is, because at the end of the day, China cannot exist and operate in the rest of the world when it's building up so many resentments and so many resistances to how they're organizing their own economic model.
Just related to China, we had a story earlier this week about the Pentagon telling the UK to focus on Europe and not involve itself in the Indo-Pacific military.
No, we don't accept that.
You don't accept that?
No, we have a responsibility, a global responsibility as a country. That's why we're partners with the United States and Australia in the AUKUS, military alliance, which is not just a security alliance, it also has huge technological potential for us to act as partners. Now, I don't think you can divide the world into, that's the Indo-Pacific theatre, this is the Euro-Atlantic theatre. Well, the one doesn't impinge on the other, therefore we can keep into this compartment, you can go into that compartment. The world is not as simple as that. As you've seen, by the way, in Europe, where who's there helping the Russians? China, North Korea, Iran. You know, so can you compartmentalize Europe and say we don't care about the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Iranians? Absolutely not. You know, these are global security issues and threats, and we as a country in Britain have a global responsibility to play our part, yes, in NATO first, no question about that, NATO first, the Euro-Atlantic, but we're also in AUKUS and we have a role to play in the Indo-Pacific.
So have you said so? Because, I mean, this
yes.
did come out of the Pentagon.
No. Well, it is a view that some in the Pentagon hold. True. And we are going to have that discussion. Our Defense Secretary had a very, very good meeting with the US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. I was there with him. It was a good discussion. And I didn't hear the Defense Secretary say to ours, by the way, would you mind keeping out of the Indo-Pacific? I didn't hear that. I heard, glad you're in AUKUS, and we've got to do more to sustain that alliance.
好，曼德尔森这番高高在上的指导，咱们就听到这儿。听完他的话，不知道大家是什么感受？我是觉得这世界变得太快，可有些人的脑子还没转过弯。大英的太阳早就落山了，可有些人脑子里还停在100多年前。他们那些对中国的看法和建议，听着一套一套的，其实根本没意识到自己几斤几两。说白了，现在谁还把英国当回事儿？人要有点自知之明，国家也一样。英国现在还真把自己当棵葱，其实也就是大家茶余饭后的谈资罢了。好，今天的内容就分享到这儿，感谢大家收看，我们下次见。